Streaming from Abbey Recording Studio in Chicago.
You are listening to Influenced, a podcast where we explore what makes great music influential.
Show. This week, we're going to focus on a band that's been around for a little bit over 40 years. Hard to believe. My name's Robert Dean.
And I'm Blake Sokoloff. And this is Influenced.
This is Influenced. So this show is about who's influenced who in rock and roll. And we think The Cure will kind of be a really interesting one because they've had some deep influences on them and on Robert Smith, of course. And some really impressive influences on others.
And just like they've had quite a storied history in just like the pop music sphere, and were just recently inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which definitely shows that they've like kept up their influence and just like the, I guess you'd say, relevance in their whole, for pretty much their entire career, and maybe even they're the most relevant today than they've ever been. I mean, they can play, like, headline pretty much any music festival in the world, like, sell out arenas across the nation and across the world. So I'd say they're definitely as relevant now as they've really ever been. Like, the Robert Smith kind of started The Cure in when he was really, really young and still in school with a lot of his school friends. And they were generally just kind of started out like trying to be like a bit of a punk band, kind of like Robert Smith was very into that, just kind of very angry and very alternative kind of rock music, like the Buzzcocks, and even like bands like Elvis Costello and the Attractions were big influences on the early Cure. So
definitely, and some earlier influences that we could also talk about were Pink Floyd for sure. Oh, definitely. And I know that Robert Smith was really into Thin Lizzy back when he was younger. Used to watch him live all the time, and has talked about how he's blown away by Thin Lizzy's live performances. So just kind of a mixed bag there. But I think you're right, Blake. As he got a little bit older, the new wave and type of influences were really big on him, like Elvis Costello.
And as kind of the Cure were starting off and kind of beginning as a band and like really starting to hit their stride, Robert Smith kind of continued to get into a lot of the more like modern of the time music. Like he was very into Joy Division, Susie and the Banshees as they started out, and like also bands like Bauhaus and New Order and Sisters of Mercy, who were kind of becoming the first kind of, so to speak, goth rockers on the scene. And that was definitely something that like he started drawing from. I guess it was also like the beginnings of like what would really be considered alternative music. And that's obviously like kind of where the Cure have been listed the majority of their music career. So that he was definitely like a very big part of that, like, early wave of post-punk and the beginnings of like the goth scenes, and that like kind of sprung about in the 80s. Especially like he was pretty indebted to Susie and the Banshees, and Susie Sue just herself, as the Cure's one of the earliest Cure major tours that they ever went on was as a support act for Susie and the Banshees in the late 70s. Which was definitely one of Robert Smith's like first like major exposures to like the full power of a band that was at its peak, and like a band that was super successful at the time. And he became really good friends and was like found himself to be fairly like-minded with Susie about just what they wanted out of music and their sense of personal style and the way they carried themselves. And Susie definitely rubbed off on Robert Smith, and like after that first Cure tour, with the Banshees was when Robert Smith first started experimenting with some of that goth makeup that he's been so like famously seen in since, and wears to this day even. And that was definitely like a direct inspiration from the way that Susie presented herself. Just like the curation of like an aura around her mystique was definitely something that Robert was very inspired by and attracted to artistically. And he even joined the Banshees for a brief period in the early '80s for their album Hyena, that has one of the more successful Susie and the Banshees songs on it, which is a cover of the Beatles track "Dear Prudence."
Yeah, and I think, as I recall, when they were out on tour together, that's when Susie and the Banshees guitar player quit in the middle of the tour, and then Robert Smith was playing some double duty.
Yeah.
On one of their tours. I don't know if it was the first one, but that definitely happened. And like you said, he jumped into the band there for a bit.
Yeah, because I believe kind of in the later '70s after the first maybe 2 or 3 Cure albums that Robert Smith was kind of getting a little burnt out of the just general gruel of touring life and being the front and center person in a band. And I know he had some personal issues with a couple of the band members at the time, which led to the bassist Simon Gallup like temporarily leaving the band, which Robert took as kind of a point to take a break, which is when he set down his microphone and picked up the lead guitar duties in the Banshees, which unfortunately led to a little bit of a falling out after about a year and a half, as the Banshees were kind of gearing up to do another tour and album, which Susie was under the impression that Robert was going to be a part of when, I guess, kind of after being in the band in Susie and the Banshees for about a year or so, Robert Smith kind of realized that he didn't really like being the person who didn't get to make the rules or really set the artistic tone for the project. I think he kind of realized that while he loved Susie's music and her influence on him as an artist, he felt like he needed to represent himself best by having his own project. And so after a year or two of being in the Banshees, he left fairly abruptly, like a week or two before the Banshees were scheduled to go out on another tour, which put Susie in a little bit of a pickle, as she had to find another guitarist in like under a month's time.
Yeah, scramble.
Yeah, so I think that kind of Robert's kind of mishandling of the ending of his time in the Banshees has kind of permanently soured his relationship with Susie Sue, unfortunately. But he got the band back together in the mid '80s and kind of started to hit their like real artistic stride with like the kind of a string of albums that they like kind of took a little bit of a more pop-centric like approach to the recording studio and decided to concentrate more on a very layered and lush, dense sound. And they started with like albums like Pornography, kind of experimented with their sound in that period. Still a fairly minimalistic band lineup, but with just like experimenting with lots of effects and just more free-form and interesting songwriting stylings.
Yeah, you can just really hear the stack of layered, synth going on there with that song.
And yeah, they're definitely starting to get kind of the hang of that dark and dreary atmosphere that they became famous for.
Polished up a little bit by just like a little bit of a less lo-fi studio experience, and then they kind of throughout the mid 80s kind of perfected this sound, and just they also went through kind of constant personnel changes, with Robert Smith being the only central member who's been throughout the entirety of the band. But they added like a new, many keyboardists and guitarists floated through the ranks, and a lot of band members would switch around from, like Lowell Tolhurst, their original drummer, ended up on keyboards and synths throughout the mid 80s to kind of add to that textured sound. And then they were experimenting with some songs like In Between Days, which is like one of the bigger hits off their mid 80s album, Head in the Door.
Definitely a top 5 Cure song for me. I love that album, and
Definitely
great song.
Yeah, definitely. And just like you can kind of definitely tell that by the mid 80s they were experimenting with more like, cuz that song is even a lot poppier than even the songs in music on Pornography, and just like the like very breathy like synth lead that throughout the choruses of this song is definitely like a very good kind of hint as to where they were going, and like what they were doing at the time. And like this was also around the time where they started getting like absolutely massive. I know there was a time after the Kiss Me Kiss Me Kiss Me album where they played, I think, a show in New York to something like 30 to like 50,000 fans at, I think it was maybe Dodger Stadium
in LA.
Oh, is that in LA?
Yeah.
Shoot, then maybe it wasn't New York. Sorry, that was my bad. But it was a Dodgers
huge show.
Yeah, huge. Like it kind of that whole era kind of culminated for them in this like massive arena show. I think there was maybe one at Madison Square Garden as well, but there was a massive show that's kind of noted that happening at Dodger Stadium where like I think it was something like 30,000 fans were like had tickets, and then something like 60 or 70,000 people showed up to the show.
Wow.
So there was just a mass conglomerate of people around the arena. And that's for music, like one of their bigger hits like that was off of the Kiss Me Kiss Me Kiss Me album. But Just Like Heaven is obviously a massive hit for the band, and just like really kind of culminated their love of like combining the layered pop music but still keeping it a little moody and dreary.
Yeah, they were definitely getting big by that time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like just like that, I mean that song is a great example of just, I mean that song could have been a Madonna track and been just as catchy, but just the fact that they can do that like arrangement to that, like basically what is basically just like your like a pop song, is pretty cool, and it definitely led to some of the most influential and timeless music that they ever created. I feel like kind of after that Kiss Me Kiss Me Kiss Me album, like Robert Smith was kind of like, I think like I've kind of figured out how to like make this like pop music, and I know the studio really well, and I know he was starting to this might sound silly to some people, but he was approaching the end of his 20s after Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, and the tour surrounding that, and he was started to freak out because he felt like all of his favorite artists and just the most notable artists throughout history had created their like testament work and just the work that they would be known for across time and throughout history before they were 30. And I think he was getting to be 28 or 29, so he was starting to freak out that he was getting too old to make
To be creative anymore.
to make hits or to be creative or to have his like major albums. I think that kind of idea started to form a little bit of a just like depressive state in his mind, that he was like potentially just a washed up like indie rocker or something like that. And then I believe there was like some personal issues that also kind of started taking their toll, and that at the end of the 80s, like I think he had like a long-term relationship that ended. Like I think it was, I don't know too much because he's a very private guy and isn't one for the tabloids or anything, but I believe he was like in a relationship with someone he had been in a relationship with pretty much since he was like a kid, or like at the end of kind of his school days, like his high school sweetheart essentially.
Wow.
They had like been together for I think over a decade at that point, and their like relationship kind of ended and fell apart. So kind of he was at the end of the 80s, he was feeling like kind of depressed, downtrodden about his like artistic abilities and his personal life, which led to him drinking a lot and experimenting with a lot more just like drugs. And I know he talks about doing a lot of psychedelics. I think ecstasy was beginning to become like a bit of a thing at the end of the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
And him and a lot of other bands at the time, like New Order, were very much into ecstasy and that kind of that scene. So I think he was experimenting with a lot of psychedelics and drinking a lot and generally not being in the best like mental shape of his life. He started writing these songs that he like as he was starting to write these songs, he kind of realized that this album was like coming together, and it was potentially going to be his magnum opus, if there was going to be a magnum opus of any band. But
At the tail end of the 1980s, Robert kind of got all the guys in the Cure together and locked him in the studio for a better part of a year. And kind of when they emerged, when they came out of the studio and saw the sunlight, they had disintegration.
for anyone to make that album is truly a testament. But that album is one of the best
Alternative albums to probably ever come out, and certainly one of the best albums to close out any decade, and certainly one of the best albums of the 80s.
Just its production kind of encapsulated a lot of the genres that kind of happened in the 80s, like goth rock and synth pop and even hints of electronic music, just pulling influences from all over the musical map
To create this like, and honestly very, very just like mind-blowing and creative and like very telling of the times album that like kind of became one of the major cornerstones of alternative music.
Yeah, fantastic album. I really like your description of what was going on with Robert Smith in those days, and leading to the perfect name of the album, right?
Oh yeah, I mean he definitely named the album Disintegration because he very much kind of felt like his own life was, for lack of a better term, disintegrating at that point.
Yeah.
and he definitely poured it all kind of into his music. And like that album is definitely like he seems to view it as well that like the if that album is going to be his legacy, then that's a pretty fine legacy to leave.
Yeah.
Like I know he's very still to this day very very fond of the album and just like what the band were saying with the album, and just kind of I would definitely say that that album solidified The Cure's legacy and just like the rock kind of hall of greats, I guess. You could put them up there with like I'm sure the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and all the just rock bands from the 60s and 70s. I would definitely say The Cure are one of the bands from the 80s and 90s that stand just as tall as those bands in the overarching just ether of pop and rock music.
Definitely.
And just like the significance that they had on music. And I feel like the Cure's significance on music really became clear in the 90s with like the rise of like alternative music and rock as a like dominating art form. And you can definitely tell it from all over, just pretty much right off the bat in like 1990 and 91 with the beginnings of the grunge scene, because that grunge scene was indebted to The Cure, and all those bands had their songs were coated in those chorus pedals that The Cure had made famous, and they were all still very like big and raucous and loud. They were still very emotional, and the lyrics were still very in touch with who the people in the bands were and who were making the music, and the lyrics are still very like dark and almost gothic in some of their imagery and just the way that they would talk about just feelings in general is very indicative of just The Cure's influence on that whole kind of genre of music. And you can definitely two of the biggest grunge bands that exude Cure influence are definitely Nirvana and the Smashing Pumpkins,
Right.
and like some of the bigger hits off Nirvana's Nevermind, like Come As You Are, like that guitar tone is straight off of a Cure record with all that chorus and just the lyrics of just like the pain and sorrow hidden in the like kind of pop melodies and sensibilities of the lyrics is definitely a big thing that Kurt Cobain and Billy Corgan and other 90s artists
We're kind of taking as a piece of influence from The Cure. As I mentioned before, like Smashing Pumpkins are probably the other like major influencey of The Cure that was a major player in kind of 90s rock. Like from the very get-go with the Smashing Pumpkins, from their music with on their first album Gish is very very Cure influenced, and then even into their later career in the 90s when they started really using the recording studio as an instrument, it definitely like shown that they had a lot of influence from Robert Smith and company.
Yeah, I think that song in particular, in 1979, it just, you hear that textured, layered effect that definitely came from The Cure, no question.
I would agree. Yeah, and you can also they were like just across the pond in the 90s. The Cure were also like huge, perhaps one of the bigger influences in the just like the shoegaze and like dream pop scenes that were happening in the early 90s as well, with like bands like the Cocteau Twins and My Bloody Valentine and Slow Dive taking huge amounts of influence from the just like textures and just like the very layered and dense approach that the Cure would take to their music, and just like also kind of incorporating a little bit of that goth sensibility to the sound as well. It was a huge, perhaps even a bigger influence than the influence the Cure held over the American music in the 90s.
Yeah, I'm definitely hearing the Cure there. Another band that may be interesting to talk about, because they've kind of said the Cure's kind of their favorite band from when they were kind of coming up was Interpol.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that gets into like a little bit of the like kind of their current influence on just like newer music, because like Interpol like started out like they were definitely like kids in the 90s when Disintegration dropped, and like they were like losing their minds to, and they were also just like big believers of just like the American grunge movements. And I know Kurt Cobain is one of Paul Banks from Interpol's like musical heroes. Kurt Cobain was also someone who would always talk up the Cure and just their influence on the scene. And so I'm sure for Paul Banks being 9 or 10 and hearing his hero Kurt Cobain talk about the Cure was definitely a very cool way for the musicians in the 2000s and 2010s to kind of get introduced to this music, because it was the music that was inspired the bands that they were inspired in the 90s. And you can definitely hear like the Cure's music and just influence throughout much of like Interpol's discography. You could probably hear it best on their first couple albums, like the Turn on the Bright Lights and Antics. And I'll play a probably my favorite track from Turn on the Bright Lights here for you all. But you can just hear the very Cure like production and the darkness that isn't necessarily even there in the notes that are being played by the musicians, but they just all together form this like vibe and create this kind of mystique and darkness that is definitely indebted to the sound that the Cure kind of popularized and perpetrated in their music.
Yeah, guitar sounds a lot like Robert Smith, doesn't it?
Definitely, and just the just like ambiance that they can create is definitely heavily indebted to the Cure and their sound. And like the Cure have had one of the more enduring influences over just music, and their style has never really gone out of fashion, and it's almost in vogue today in the late 2010s with like super huge, like some of the most popular alternative and indie artists of today, like Mitski and Phoebe Bridgers, and a lot of the new artists, even like older artists like Sharon Van Etten and others have been like indebted to the Cure. And like Phoebe Bridgers from who's like kind of most well known for like her solo project and her project with Conor Oberst, Better Oblivion Community Center, recently covered probably the biggest Cure song when she stopped at the Spotify studios to record her like Spotify single within this last year. But just the fact that the Cure can show this immense influence over like new artists and people like Phoebe Bridgers was born in 1994, like 4 years after even Disintegration came out. So the fact that like musicians that were born after this band did most of their important music can still be discovering and inspired by this music definitely shows that like The Cure are one of the more important, if not one of the most important bands that have come about since like the 60s and 70s, like gave us all the bands that inspired everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But here's Phoebe Bridgers doing Friday I'm in Love.
I don't care if Monday's blue, Tuesday's gray, and Wednesday too. Thursday, I don't care about you. It's Friday, I'm in love. Monday, you can fall apart. Tuesday, Wednesday, break my heart. Thursday doesn't.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that cover was chosen by her fan base because I think she offered like 4 or 5 songs for her fans to choose, like which song she would cover for her Spotify session. And the fans chose Friday I'm in Love. So that also is just a testament to The Cure's enduring popularity with not just musicians, but like music fans and people who are like immensely just into emotional and very, very invested music.
Yeah.
I think The Cure are one of the best at that, and probably one of the best just in general.
No, I would definitely agree. Great band. Great that they've been around so long.
Definitely.
Over 40 years now, and definitely deserve to be put into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for sure.
Definitely. Certainly. I feel like we've kind of traced The Cure from their roots to now, so we'll leave you with this early one from The Cure. It's Boys Don't Cry off their first album, and I think it was even their debut single.
Yeah, I think it was either their first or second single. It was the first single to really pop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, here you go. Boys Don't Cry, and this has been Influenced.
But I know that this time I have said too much, been too unkind. I try to laugh about